Hello, my name's Sam Harwood and I'm an Extension Officer with the local land service, and today we're here at Tokau in a paddock that's been heavily affected by waterlogging. And that leads into our discussion with Peter today, an agronomist from Taree, and we'll be talking about waterlogging and the implications for nitrogen.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, look, we're standing in this paddock and it's quite obviously there's patches here that the establishment's been affected. As we get higher, the pasture's grown all right. Waterlogging's had quite a big impact. And when we look in the last 3 years, we've seen dramatic, long extended periods of waterlogging. If we go back to the 21 flood, even though it was very wet, the ground dried out, it was relatively warm, and pastures were able to re-establish and grow. But where waterlogging sits around, and we've seen that in 24 and in 25, where we've had above average rainfall and extended periods, like not just 1 or 2 weeks, but 3 months of just solid waterlogged conditions, then the implications and the effects are really quite profound. So there's plenty of work to say that even 1 week has a lot of effect, and it affects the establishment, as we've seen here. It affects the oxygen content in the soil, and that really impacts how plants can grow. There are some plants like ryegrass which are quite tolerant, and we're fortunate that's one of our major species. But others, even like maize, even 1 week can reduce yields by 20 or 30%. And it is hard to recover that. In some cases you can recover to a degree, but the impacts are quite long. And again, on a dairy farm, those impacts extend to the cattle's feet, their general condition, walking in the mud, mastitis. But for the plants, it's an extended period where nitrogen is not being produced or not being made available. And so what we tend to see is a really nitrogen stress condition that's hard to treat until that plant comes out of a waterlogging. So if we look at these formulas in the slides here, we see that what normally happens in terms of nitrogen is that the organic matter in the soil releases nitrogen every single day, and that goes up in the summer, it reduces in winter. It's more when there's wet conditions and less when it's cold or dry. But in a normal course of events, the plant is using every day that little bit of nitrogen that's been released, and it converts from organic matter to ammonium and then to nitrate. And that's all done by bacteria, and it requires oxygen in the soil. But if we go to a waterlogged situation, what we see is that the organic matter's still got nitrogen. It can convert some to ammonium, but it doesn't move into the nitrate phase. And this is what happens, that in those extended periods, we're getting less and less nitrate. The roots aren't exploring the profile as much. And what we've seen, particularly from late sowing, wet waterlogged conditions, is that the plants are struggling, low growth rates, and really quite significant effects that can't be dealt with until that starts to dry up, and we're entering into that phase now.
So Peter, we heard about the implications there. What can we do to recover from these waterlogging events?
Well, Sam, while the soils are actually saturated, it's not a lot you can do. You can get responses to nitrogen, but with high prices of urea, there's always a consideration that you'll lose what you put on. So the general advice in terms of managing nitrogen is either put it on about a week or 10 days before the event comes, and with things like East Coast lows, we can anticipate that. So get the nitrogen on so the plant's got nitrogen before the waterlogging event, or wait till it starts to dry out. Wait for that ground to dry. And in some cases, with drones, we'll talk about this, you can actually go in before you can actually get the tractor on the paddock, but it needs to be on that drying out phase. And what we've experienced this year is that it just starts to dry out, and then we have another front come through, and it's going to go back into waterlogged conditions. Most likely you're going to lose a fair bit of it, and that's been really difficult to deal with. But if we have a look at some of the data, here's a situation we've talked about before, that in an East Coast low, we had a period where we put nitrogen on before the East Coast low. We got great responses in Kikuyu. We put it on just before this East Coast low and no response. You can see in the data that there was no response. But after that dried out, we sowed some ryegrass, within about 6 weeks, and we applied nitrogen, and we got very good responses to nitrogen because the levels of soil nitrogen were low, but we got good growth from those plants, and you can recover. But it's important you have to wait till that ground actually dries out, apply the nitrogen, and you will recover to some degree.
So Peter, we've heard what we can do to recover from these events. What can we do in the long term to manage for the loss associated with these waterlogging?
Yeah, good point. We do have to have a long-term view that these events will happen again. Flooding's quite normal, and East Coast lows are a normal part of the environment here. So the key things that I see is, firstly, aim to sow early. Plants that are well established, when they do get a waterlogging event, will survive better. What we see in this paddock is the losses during that establishment phase. The plants are a lot more susceptible. So had this area been established and the plants up above, it possibly could have survived that period. So sowing time, which is sort of late March, early May, is ideal. Get them up, get the roots established, and they will withstand waterlogging a lot better. So we've seen that this year. The other thing, as I was mentioned, is fertiliser timing. We can anticipate these events. Try and get fertiliser, get the plants well fertilised. Definitely you see in some of the photos here we can have urine stains looking quite healthy, but where it's nitrogen stressed, the plants are really affected. So having adequate nitrogen before the event also helps plants survive through that event. The other thing that we are seeing these days is that there are things, the drones or helicopters do offer a ability to sow when you normally wouldn't get on with a tractor or whatever. And that can be sowing time, it can be applying fertiliser. And more farmers are taking up the advantage of this technology to get the timing right. We've seen over the years too that good drainage, particularly on the Neils farms, have really pioneered the way for laser level drainage. They need to be shallow, wide, carry the water away, and they have to be connected to drains that will carry that water away. So these are really good technologies that if you're in low-lying, particularly high water table environments, they really do have some application. And finally, I think we're seeing more and more that having high and dry feed pads where we can move cattle off waterlogged paddocks, be able to feed them without interrupting their diet, and they're certainly keeping them out of those waterlogged pug paddocks, is becoming more and more important for a number of reasons. So they're the big ticket items. I think we will go through dry periods, we'll go through wet periods, but we do have to be prepared and learn how to manage these situations for the long run.